South Africa in the 20th century, there was a system called Apartheid that segregated and discriminated on the grounds of race. One big part of Apartheid was changing of the education system to Bantu education. This new education system segregated and discriminated based on race. Bantu education did this a number of ways to schools with black or non-white students. Before Bantu education in South Africa, most schools with black students and non-white students were run by missionaries that were given state aid for over a century. These schools were very successful. Many missionary schools graduated had gone on to become political leaders, and a good example of this is Nelson Mandela. There was a few problems with missionary schools. One of them was not a lot of students attended, and they didn't properly track who did and didn't attend. Another problem, according to Henry Vaughan, who was the head of the Department of Native Affairs at the time, was that young tribal people were returning home from work in the cities with a puffed up radical white man ideas that threatened the censorship and all dignity and honour of the chieftains. These problems were called native problems by the government at the time. This was a problem because young black people were being influenced by white people and were breaking tradition by questioning their chieftains. Henry Vaughan had other motives to set up Bantu education, and its main aim was to keep the white government in control of South Africa that was majority black. Henry Vaughan got this motive from an African survey by Lloyd Haley, who was one of the British Empire's top colonial administrations. In the survey, he reports on the government throughout the whole of Africa. In the survey, he says, indirect rule by which white governments had used headmen and chieftains to conduct loyal administrations could not survive. Education, young Africans would not put up with it. It was a massive problem because South Africa had more educated Africans than any other part of the continent. In 1949, the South African government made a commission to solve these problems. The commission was run by W.W.M. Elsevier, who is an archaeologist. It started early 1949 and ended in 1951. The commission had to study if the African or non-white students were getting an equal or unequal education. The Education Commission is known as the Elsevier Commission. In 1951, the Elsevier Commission urged the government to take charge of black education in South Africa, then part of a general education system so they could be part of an economic plan for the country. The Bantu Education Act was proposed in 1953. A year later it passed, but it didn't come into effect until 1955. This gave the Department of Native Affairs full control over education. With this power, they decided to change the course completely to solve the problem with education. When Henrik Vaughan was questioned about Bantu education and why he didn't change, he said, "What is the use of teaching Bantu maths when it cannot use it in practice? There is no place for natives in European communities above the level of certain labour forms." The education was aimed at training the children for manual labour and other low-skill work. The government deemed it suitable for blacks and non-whites. This was to make blacks accepting of being subservient to whites in South Africa. This had loads of negative effects because the school's funding was coming from tax paid by the communities that they served. Because black people worked mainly low-income jobs, the black schools received only a fraction of the amount of money that was available to the white schools. It also meant that for black people in the future it would be less education. This was met with backlash back because most people didn't want this new education. Quote, the Bantu Education Act was especially represented by African middle class, evoking impassionable protest from teachers as well as students and parents. If any teacher objected, they were posted to remote parts of the country or else would be sacked. Henrik Vaughan showed he wasn't messing around by sacking 116 teachers who objected within the first year of coming into effect. If Annie's child did not attend the reform, they be entitled to any state-assisted education. Henrik Vaughan provided what he meant by having 7,000 children removed from the school's register, so they were not entitled to any education. Henrik Vaughan withdrew the government grants from church schools that tired to defy his instructions. Where missions or blacks tried to start new schools, he used the power of the act, gave him to refuse them permission to open. There was also an attempt by activists to make secret schools called culture clubs that would give a child a better education, but most had got caught by the end of the 1950s. One of the original problems it did solve was the attendance. After Bantu Education Act was passed, the number of Africans receiving primary education more than doubled to 2 million within the decade. But even though it solved one problem, it caused another problem because the changing of courses. Teachers was to take place in the student's native tongue, though Symbolism also included classes in English and Afrikaans. This problem was that there was a shortage of qualified teachers because of teacher-student ratios ranging 1 to 40 and 1 to 60. African secondary schools and universities for blacks were set up in rural areas to make it harder for students. This was done in order to exclude black students from the influence of the suburbs and the cities. The government also wanted less black people in the cities anyway by making the second in country. It meant people were going to school or moving out of the city. Both ways suited the government at the time. The Bantu Education Act was replaced by the Education and Training Act of 1979, but segregation and unequal student facilities still happened. This was replaced by the South African Schools Act in 1996 that stopped segregation and in the main gave equal facilities. Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. When I was doing my research, one of the worst things I read was in Nelson Mandela's book, Long Walk to Freedom, but I think it was true about Bantu education. Quote, Professor Matthew wrote at the time, education is for ignorance and for inferiority. In Vaughan schools is the worst than no education at all. This was a system to keep people to stop them from having any sort of future better than their parents.